In the shadow of World War II's most devastating battles, there was another war being fought, one invisible to the naked eye. While tanks rolled across Europe and planes filled the skies, the deadliest enemy wasn't always the one holding a gun. It was microscopic, relentless, and had killed more soldiers throughout history than any weapon ever forged. For thousands of years, infection was the silent killer on every battlefield. A simple scratch could become a death sentence. Gangrene, sepsis, pneumonia. These invisible enemies claimed countless lives. But in the midst of humanity's darkest hour, a miracle was born. This is the story of how penicillin, kept secret by the Allied forces, became the most powerful weapon that never fired a shot. September 1939. As Hitler's forces invaded Poland, military commanders on all sides knew a grim truth. For every soldier killed in combat, 2 more would die from infected wounds. In World War I, infection had killed hundreds of thousands. Doctors could do little more than watch as young men succumbed to bacteria that no amount of surgery or nursing could stop. The pre-penicillin battlefield was a horror show. A bullet wound to the leg, if it didn't hit an artery, should have been survivable. But within days, the wound would turn red, then purple. Fever would set in. The tissue would begin to die, turning black with gangrene. Amputation was often the only option if the infection hadn't already spread to the bloodstream. Streptococcus, staphylococcus, pneumococcus, these bacteria were everywhere. In the soil, in the air, on unwashed hands. Every field dressing, every surgical instrument, every drop of water could carry death. And doctors were powerless. Doctors said, "We had sulfa drugs, yes, they helped with some infections. But for the worst cases, septicemia, gas gangrene, severe pneumonia, we could only offer morphine and prayer." The survival rate for severe wound infections was perhaps 30%, perhaps. But 11 years before the war began, in a cluttered London laboratory, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming made a discovery that would change everything. September 1928. Fleming returned from vacation to find his laboratory in disarray. A petri dish containing Staphylococcus bacteria had been contaminated by mold, the kind that grows on old bread. Most scientists would have tossed it in the trash, but Fleming noticed something extraordinary. Around the mold, there was a clear ring, a zone where no bacteria grew. The mold was killing the bacteria. Fleming identified it as Penicillium notatum and called the antibacterial substance it produced penicillin. He published his findings in 1929, but the discovery was largely ignored for over a decade. Why? Because Fleming couldn't figure out how to produce penicillin in large quantities or keep it stable. It was a laboratory curiosity, nothing more. Or so it seemed. The Oxford team races against time, 1939 to 1941. As war engulfed Europe, 2 scientists at Oxford University, Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, and Ernst Boris Chain, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, became obsessed with Fleming's forgotten discovery. They understood what Fleming had found, a weapon against bacteria, more powerful than anything medicine had ever known. But turning a moldy petri dish into a medicine that could save lives required solving impossible problems. They needed to grow massive amounts of mold, extract the active ingredient, purify it, and prove it worked. All while bombs fell on London. The Oxford team worked in secret, racing against time. They grew penicillium mold in every container they could find. Bedpans, milk bottles, pie tins. The laboratory looked more like a brewery than a research facility. By early 1941, they had extracted enough penicillin for their first human trial. February 12, 1941. Albert Alexander, a 43-year-old police constable, lay dying in Oxford's Radcliffe Infirmary. A rose thorn had scratched his face while he was gardening. A trivial injury, but the wound had become infected. The bacteria had spread to his blood, his lungs, his bones. Abscesses covered his scalp. His face was swollen beyond recognition. He had perhaps days to live. Dr. Florey made the decision. They would use their entire supply of penicillin, just enough for 5 days of treatment, on this dying man. Narrator: the first injection was given at 10 a.m. By evening, Alexander's fever had dropped. Within 24 hours, he was eating, talking, and laughing. The abscesses were shrinking. The swelling in his face had disappeared. It was, by all accounts, a miracle. But on the 5th day, the penicillin ran out. The Oxford team had used every drop they could produce. Without continued treatment, the infection returned. Within a month, Albert Alexander was dead. The experiment was both a triumph and a tragedy. Penicillin worked spectacularly, but they couldn't make enough of it. Not nearly enough. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. America entered the war, and with it came resources beyond imagination. British scientists knew what they had to do: bring penicillin to America, turn it into a mass-produced medicine, and keep it secret from the Axis powers at all costs. In 1941, Florey and his colleague Norman Heatley flew to the United States with a desperate plea: help us make penicillin in quantities large enough to save thousands. But there was a problem. If German submarines sank their plane or ship, the mold cultures would be lost, and with them, possibly the war. So Heatley did something extraordinary. He smeared penicillium spores into the lining of his coat. If they were captured, if the cultures were destroyed, the mold could be recovered from his clothing. He became a living smuggler of humanity's greatest hope. The Americans threw everything they had at the problem. The U.S. government recruited pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb. They approached agricultural scientists at the USDA research lab in Peoria, Illinois. The question was simple but daunting: how do you grow billions of units of penicillin? The breakthrough came from an unlikely place. A lab assistant named Mary Hunt scoured local markets for moldy produce. On a moldy cantaloupe from a Peoria fruit market, she found a strain of Penicillium chrysogenum, that produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original mold. That cantaloupe became the ancestor of nearly all penicillin-producing molds used today. Combined with a fermentation technique using corn steep liquor, a waste product from corn processing, American scientists could suddenly produce penicillin in industrial quantities. By 1943, American pharmaceutical companies were using 10,000-gallon tanks to ferment penicillin. Production skyrocketed from virtually nothing to billions of units per month. But there was a catch. Everything was classified as a military secret. The Allied command made a calculated decision. Penicillin would be reserved exclusively for Allied troops. Not a single vial would reach civilian markets. Not a word would leak to the press. German and Japanese forces would continue fighting without the miracle drug. This wasn't just about medical care. It was psychological warfare. Allied doctors could take risks. German doctors couldn't. They could operate more aggressively, treat infections that would be death sentences in enemy field hospitals, and return wounded soldiers to combat in weeks instead of months. The secrecy was extreme. Pharmaceutical company employees signed confidentiality agreements. Medical officers were forbidden from discussing penicillin in letters home. Empty penicillin vials were collected from field hospitals and destroyed so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. German intelligence knew the Allies had something. Their field agents reported rumors of a wonder drug, but they didn't know what it was, how it was made, or how to replicate it. By the time they captured enough information to begin their own research, it was too late. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As 156,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, they carried with them an invisible advantage: 2.3 million doses of penicillin. The statistics were staggering. In World War I, pneumonia killed 18% of all hospitalized American soldiers. In World War II, with penicillin, that number dropped to less than 1%. Doctors on the front lines described it as miraculous. Soldiers with infected shrapnel wounds, who would have died days earlier from septicemia, were sitting up and joking with nurses after 48 hours of penicillin treatment. Men who would have lost limbs to gangrene kept them. Pneumonia, once a death sentence in the cold, wet trenches, became a manageable condition. We'd see boys come in with compound fractures, bones sticking out through the skin, covered in mud and debris. 3 years earlier, that meant amputation, maybe death. With penicillin, we'd clean the wound, give them the drug, and watch the infection just vanish. It felt like magic. If penicillin was crucial in Europe, it was absolutely vital in the Pacific. The tropical jungles of the South Pacific were a bacterial nightmare. Tropical ulcers, infected sores that could eat through flesh to the bone, were epidemic. Scrub typhus, malaria, dengue fever, and dozens of bacterial infections ravaged troops. Before penicillin, the Pacific theater had infection rates 3 times higher than Europe. But penicillin changed everything. By 1944, every American soldier in the Pacific carried penicillin in their combat medical kit. The drug could survive the tropical heat and humidity. Medics could administer it within minutes of injury, stopping infections before they started. The Japanese, fighting without penicillin, suffered catastrophically. Their field hospitals became death traps. Minor wounds turned fatal. Their soldiers knew that injury meant a death sentence, not from the wound itself, but from what came after. August 1945, the war ended, and with it, the secret of penicillin was finally revealed to the world. The numbers told an incredible story. In World War I, infection had killed or permanently disabled hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. In World War II, that number was reduced by 90%. Penicillin didn't just save lives. It saved an entire generation. Conservative estimates suggest penicillin saved between 12 and 15% of all Allied soldiers who were treated with it. That's hundreds of thousands of lives. Some historians put the number even higher, as many as 150,000 to 200,000 soldiers who would have died from infection survived to go home. The question haunts history. Why didn't Germany develop penicillin? They had brilliant scientists. They knew about Fleming's discovery. So what happened? The answer is complex. German scientists did research penicillin, but they focused on sulfa drugs, an earlier generation of antibiotics they'd already mastered. They made a calculated bet that improving sulfa drugs would be faster than starting from scratch with penicillin. They were wrong. But there was another factor: the Allied bombing campaign. German pharmaceutical factories were priority targets. By 1943, German chemical production was crippled. Even if they'd wanted to mass-produce penicillin, they lacked the industrial capacity. There were attempts. In 1944, German scientists in occupied France did manage to produce small amounts of penicillin, but by then, it was far too late. The Allies were producing 1,000 times more, and the war was already lost. When penicillin finally reached civilian markets in 1945, it triggered a medical revolution. Diseases that had killed for millennia, scarlet fever, pneumonia, syphilis, gonorrhea, rheumatic fever, became curable with a simple injection. Child mortality plummeted. Maternal deaths from childbirth infections dropped by 90%. The average human lifespan began climbing at an unprecedented rate. Penicillin, more than any single drug before or since, changed what it meant to be human. In 1945, Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Boris Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Fleming became a global celebrity, but he always insisted he'd simply observed nature's genius. It was Florey and Chain who turned a laboratory curiosity into a life-saving medicine. But the penicillin story has a darker chapter that's rarely told. While Allied soldiers were saved by the millions, Axis prisoners of war and civilians in occupied territories had no access to the drug. In German POW camps holding Allied soldiers, penicillin was smuggled in by the Red Cross. But in Allied camps holding German prisoners, no such reciprocity existed. This was the brutal calculus of total war. The Allies made a choice. Their soldiers' lives were worth more than their enemies. It's estimated that tens of thousands of Axis soldiers died from infections that penicillin could have treated. The miracle drug saved millions, but its absence condemned thousands more. Today, antibiotics are so common, we take them for granted. Every year, they save millions of lives worldwide. But the story of penicillin reminds us that medical progress isn't always a smooth march forward. Sometimes it's accelerated by war, funded by military necessity, and hidden behind walls of secrecy. The mass production techniques developed for penicillin during World War II became the template for producing all antibiotics that followed. The pharmaceutical industry as we know it, capable of producing billions of doses of life-saving drugs, was built on the foundation laid during those desperate war years. Fleming, Florey, Chain, these names are remembered. But penicillin's triumph was built by thousands of forgotten heroes. The lab assistant who found a moldy cantaloupe in an Illinois market. The factory workers who operated fermentation tanks day and night. The medics who administered the drug under fire on beaches and in jungles. The soldiers who lived because of a decision made in a laboratory half a world away. Today, those World War II veterans are in their 90s and hundreds. Many of them owe their lives to a microscopic mold they never saw and a secret weapon they didn't know they carried. They came home, raised families, built the modern world, all because of a miracle that began with a cluttered laboratory and a scientist who looked at mold and saw hope. Penicillin didn't just win World War II. It won the future. It proved that science, ingenuity, and cooperation could defeat humanity's oldest enemies. In the darkest hour of human history, when evil seemed unstoppable, a simple mold showed us that hope could come from the most unexpected places. The invisible weapon, the secret that saved millions, the miracle in the mold. In memory of the scientists, medics, soldiers, and factory workers who turned a laboratory discovery into humanity's greatest medical triumph. But there's one final chapter to this story, and it's being written right now. Today, antibiotic resistance threatens to undo everything penicillin achieved. Bacteria are evolving, learning to resist the drugs that once killed them effortlessly. Some scientists warn we're entering a post-antibiotic era where routine infections could once again become deadly. The race is on to develop new antibiotics, new strategies, new miracles. Just as the scientists of the 1940s fought an invisible war against bacteria, today's researchers fight against evolution itself. The legacy of penicillin isn't just what it did, it's the reminder that human ingenuity, when pushed to its limits, can achieve the impossible.